Hi, my name is Araj, and our group is focusing on the Ford Pinto case. My connection to topic was designed for safety, and I also did one discussion question.
Hello, I'm Riley. I'm going to be talking about how our case study connects to section 1.2, which is the introduction to the APEGA Code of Ethics.
I am Luke, and I'm going to be doing the summary and basic facts of our case.
Hello, my name is Artem, and I'll be doing the connection for politics and neoliberalism as well as one discussion question.
The case that we decide to discuss is the Ford Pinto and the unethical engineering business practices behind it, which resulted in many injuries and fatalities. In September 1970, Ford released the Pinto, in an effort to compete with rival car models such as the AMC Gremlin and the Chevrolet Vega. Ford President Lee Iacocca made many unsafe choices to get the car released as soon as possible. During development of the car, Iacocca on a car less than 2,000 pounds with a price of less than $2,000. It was an extreme challenge for designers to make a car with appropriate safety that met these criteria. As design was underway, Iacocca forced an extremely short timeline with development, taking 25 months while the industry average was 43. Feels that some processes done at the same time when they should have been done separately, which led to a very static car design that could not be changed much. Any decision that could potentially threaten to delay the project was heavily discouraged, as speed was the number one priority in design. This combination of errors led to the Pinto having a terrible fuel tank placement that was extremely dangerous. Ford rushed the design to ensure they released the car before the NHTSA would be able to implement a Car Safety Act in the upcoming year. The Pinto placed its fuel tank near the rear end and had many issues such as a weak rear bumper. This made it susceptible to fuel leaks and fire if involved in a collision. This design also made escaping the car harder, which further added to its dangerous design. This car led to many recalls and ended up with over 117 lawsuits due to the safety of the car. The NHTSA also came under fire as they refused to order a recall of the car. This led to speculation of them being unethically influenced by industry members. The largest ethical problem in this case came up, however, when an internal Ford cost-benefit analysis came to light, in which Ford argued that instead of redesigning the car, which would be costly and time-consuming, it would instead be cheaper to simply risk the lawsuits and pay out any victims of the car's poor design. This ultimately resulted in over 100 lawsuits against them. This case is a perfect example of how catastrophic designs can be when you prioritize money and business for the safety of designs.
Ethical dilemma, choosing profit and convenience over public safety despite having the data and means to prevent harm. As briefly mentioned by Luke, the ethical dilemma in this case stems from the safety of the Pinto, or the lack thereof. The fuel tank placement on the Ford Pinto was a primary concern of the car, as its placement made it extremely prone to leaking and eventually having the car explode upon impact. The fact that engineers knew of this potential risks associated with the placement, and additionally that would not meet the upcoming safety requirements from the NHTSA, they still chose to rush to release the car rather than invest the time and money to implement a safe design. And that's exactly what defines the ethical issue in this case. Ford even performed a cost-benefit analysis and considered the costs necessary to make modifications to each Pinto to make it safer, and they deliberately chose not to, believing that the costs associated with the inevitable lawsuits to follow this design failure would not outweigh the cost of making the modifications to increase safety. It all boiled down to the last point of ethical failure. Ford time and time again prioritized financial savings over human lives, knowingly and deliberately.
In section 1.2 of this course, we are introduced to the five APEGA rules of conduct, which can be connected to this case study by examining how the decisions made by the Ford engineers either follow or go against this code of ethics. As someone living in 2025 who is accustomed to the strong bodies of regulation and standards of safety that are present throughout our society, it is very easy to look at this case and think, how is it even possible to put a car into production that had such a potential for harm and could explode so easily? But the Pinto did in fact meet the minimum federal safety requirement at the time of its release. Although, the release of the Pinto was rushed in order to avoid an upcoming change in the regulations of fuel tank safety coming from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, the NHTSA. Ford went on to lobby against this change, and ultimately it was not implemented, which allowed for the Pinto to continue being produced as is. In this case, technically speaking, the engineers at Ford did comply with the applicable statutes and bylaws in their professional practice as outlined in the fourth rule of conduct from APEGA. But this was only made possible due to the influence of Ford on the NHTSA to avoid the upcoming change in regulation. After public outrage following a journalist Mark Dowie's expose article on the Ford Pinto that came out in 1977, the NHTSA did modify some existing standards to deem the Pinto's fuel tank unsafe and prompt Ford to voluntarily recall the Pintos that were produced from 1971 to 1976 in the summer of 1978. All of this goes to show how poorly regulated the auto industry was during this time, and that both public opinion and corporate lobbying can have a massive influence on the regulating bodies of an industry. Evaluating the ethics of the engineering decisions made in this case using APEGA's first rule of conduct, that is, to hold paramount the health, safety, and welfare of the public, and to have regard for the environment, does not paint a pretty picture for Ford. In the article, The Ford Pinto Case and the Development of Auto Safety Regulations, Matthew Lee outlines how this case took place during the time where the safety of cars was at a turning point. Several years prior to the Pinto release, auto safety was largely unregulated. Manufacturers and consumers alike, for the most part, prioritized the style of a car over its safety. Traditionally, it was the attitude of both the industry and the public that auto safety, to a large extent, was the responsibility of the driver, not the car manufacturer. This began to change around the time of the Pinto, with the recent creation of regulating bodies such as the NHTSA, but it was still a new attitude. Even though safety was not the priority for consumers and regulation was still a new concept in the auto industry, in the case of the Ford Pinto, the fact is that Ford knew the dangers of the Pinto's design, and they had the ability to modify this design and even considered the cost associated with it, but chose not to for economic reasons. This clearly goes against the first rule of conduct from APEGA by explicitly placing profit over the safety of the public, which in this case resulted in hundreds of unnecessary deaths. This illustrates a significant failure by the engineers and management at Ford to make ethical design choices and shows the willingness of corporations to place profit over the safety of its consumer. I feel this discussion highlights the need for regulating bodies such as APEGA and the NHTSA across industries to ensure that standards for practice are set in stone to avoid unnecessary harm to the public and that companies are held accountable for their actions and feel pressured to be ethical in their work.
Connection 2, Design for Safety. Let's take a look at the Ford Pinto case through the lens of design for safety. The Pinto's gas tank placement made it vulnerable to explosions during rear-end collisions. Even though internal crash tests revealed this flaw, Ford chose not to redesign the vehicle, estimating it would be cheaper to settle lawsuits for potential injuries and fatalities. This is a clear example of a safety trade-off gone wrong. Ford prioritized production costs and speed to market over user safety, treating human lives as a line item in a budget. It highlights what happens when cost becomes the dominant design driver without ethical checks. This also ties in with the concept of preventing unintended consequences. Ford failed to ask the right questions. They didn't fully observe how the car would perform in a real-world scenario, in a real-world case, and ultimately ignored the potential misuse or worst-case outcomes. This wasn't just an engineering failure, it was a moral one. The case remains a strong reminder for when we design anything, from vehicles to codes, safety isn't a feature to tack on later, it has to be built in from the start.
The third aspect. So the third connection to the ENGG 513 course is the neoliberal aspect of the Ford Pinto case. Now it begins with the market efficiency point, as Ford as a company that follows neoliberalism, makes sure to follow this ideology of competitiveness and making sure to keep your profits high and your costs low. And so to that, they would take a look at their cost-benefit analysis, which at the time realized that there was a problem with the gas tank, that it would cost them a lot of money. However, they analyzed that it would be cheaper to just absorb the lawsuits instead, to follow the neoliberal policy of keeping your profits up, your costs down, but however at the cost of public safety. Now, this wouldn't be as much of an issue if there was regulation to stop that, but another tenet of neoliberalism is deregulation. And the lack of timed regulation from the NHTSA allowed the Ford engineers to design an unsafe gas tank. And then ethically, as they were more responsible to their company than the public, they continued with said design, even though there would be problems in the future that they knew, but the regulation did not require them to fix that. And so this brings me to the final point of neoliberalism, is the culture that it creates, especially in engineers, because it influences them to look at the company's values more closely than values of the public. It makes them over prioritize company profit at the expense of the public. That creates a big issue for everybody. So the discussion question for the
Discussion questions. The two questions related to design for safety are safety trade-offs ever truly neutral, or do they always come with ethical implications? The second was when cost, time, and safety are all in conflict, what ethical responsibilities should take priority? How should engineers respond under pressure? Both of these were very big examples in our case. The first one being what seems neutral to people in the business, what seemed neutral to Ford at the time. The second one was the engineers who took part in designing the Pinto and releasing it. How were they supposed to respond under pressure? How were they supposed to respond under the fact that their management wanted them to roll out a car before the NHTSA requirements hit?
The discussion question I came up with relating to section 1.2 of the course, which is the introduction to the Code of Ethics, is looking back on how the lack of safety standards and regulation in the auto industry at the time of this case had devastating impacts on public safety. Do you feel there is a lesson that can be learned from this case study and the evolution of the auto industry that can be applied to today's industries of emerging technology, such as AI, autonomous driving, etc.?
For the discussion questions, the question for the neoliberal connection is what is the extent to which engineers should allow neoliberal views to influence their ethics and decision making? This is just again a callback to the engineers at Ford. They made an ethical choice to include lawsuit costs versus potential safety costs of the new gas tank. And so, where's the line that people draw when you're an engineer and design the car? So, in closing, this case went over the Ford Pinto case in this future one. So, in closing, in this presentation, we went over the Ford Pinto case, the background knowledge of it, how it was, why it was made, when it was made, who was in charge back then, what were the views people were following. And then we went over to the ethical dilemma that the engineers has faced, that to prioritize company values over the ethical values they had to the public safety, as they made sure to keep the costs down, at the expense of public safety. We went over how this course connects to the engineering 513 course and how it's all interlinked, how the engineers didn't follow safety rules as much as they should have. They let neoliberalism influence their decision making and what they said to allow. And then we finally asked some discussion questions that would hopefully make you think critically about what you do as an engineer. When you draw the line, what are some things you should avoid from doing? And on that note, thank you for watching this presentation. We hope you enjoyed.